Welcome to the Kurdverse. Have you ever said, I'm lactose intolerant, but I can have goat milk? Or, I'm lactose intolerant, so I can't eat cheese? Or conversely, wondered why, when you're lactose intolerant, you can eat cheese? I'm Lisa Kaywood, corporate functionary by day, home cheesemaker by night. One thing I've learned as people began confiding in me about their dairy interests and challenges is that there's a tremendous amount of confusion and just plain misinformation out in the world about dairy sensitivities. So today, I want to spend some time untangling some of those ideas so that if you or someone you care about has dairy sensitivities, you can maybe figure out how to navigate them. I also want to be really clear that if your reactions to dairy are extremely severe, you should definitely not consume dairy in any form without discussing things with your doctor. But hopefully this episode will give you a better understanding of what might be happening in your body when you eat dairy, and why some things might be fine for you and others absolutely are not. So let me begin with a personal disclosure. I myself have some dairy sensitivities. They're new. They began suddenly in February of 2021, peaked in March, and things didn't really calm down for me again until about August. And I still have to be careful about some forms of dairy, and I likely always will. When it first started, my doctor told me to just eliminate dairy and see if that resolved things. No! Needless to say, I was not excited about this. In fact, I spent several weeks cycling back and forth through the first several stages of grief, often several times a day. And at a certain point, in a defiant mood, I just cheated and went back to putting butter on my toast in the morning. And then I ate a couple of squares of dark chocolate. And both of those turned out to be just fine. Now, fortunately for me, I already knew a fair amount about milk chemistry and what happens to it in the course of cheesemaking when all of that started. So I had some clues as to why butter and chocolate containing dairy might be okay for me. But I'll also say that in the last year, I've also read a lot of scientific papers on the microbiome of the human gut and how it interacts with what you eat. Long story short, those microbial cultures I keep talking about as being the basis of cheesemaking, they're even more important to your digestive and overall health than I ever imagined. So let's begin with the basics: lactose and lactose intolerance. Most of the time when people have digestive issues with milk, they assume it's because they're lactose intolerant, because that's what they've heard of. And many people are lactose intolerant after a certain point in their lives because they don't have the gene for lactase persistence, which means the ongoing ability to break down lactose. Lactase is the enzyme that splits the lactose molecules into two smaller sugars, glucose and galactose, which can be absorbed in the small intestine. Otherwise, that more complex lactose molecule ferments in the large intestine and causes bloating, gas, and other unpleasantness. That lactase persistent gene, by the way, has evolved at least twice in the last 5 to 10,000 years, once in North Central Europe and once in East Africa, and also possibly independently in Southern Arabia as well. What percentage of a region's population has the gene varies a lot across Afro-Eurasia, from the 90th percentile in Northern Europe to the low to mid-80s in East Africa and Arabia to 12% in China, and virtually none in coastal West Africa. But the ability to consume dairy is definitely not an all-or-nothing thing for lactose-intolerant people. Here I'll note the case of Mongols, who have some of the lowest rates of lactase persistence in Eurasia. But they're also a people who have, for centuries, lived largely by pastoralism and the products of their livestock. And even today, many people in Mongolia get around a third of their daily caloric intake in the summertime from dairy products. So how do they eat that much dairy without spending every day in distress? So there are two answers here, the simple one and the more complicated one. For now, I'll talk about the simple one, fermentation. Virtually all the dairy that people in Mongolia and most other parts of Africa and Asia consume is at least partially fermented, which means that some portion of the lactose has already been broken down and converted to lactic acid, glucose, and galactose, which pretty much everyone can digest. In other words, our microbial friends pre-digest the sugars so we don't have to. In addition, when you make cheese, much of the sugar content of the milk stays with the whey. So when you drain the whey, you're also removing a lot of the milk sugars you would be consuming if you were drinking liquid milk. Meanwhile, at the west end of Eurasia, you recall that in episode 2, I talked about how in cultured rennet cheeses, the cultures continue to break down the sugars, fats, and proteins in the cheese curd as the cheese ages. So sugars are built to be quick hits of energy, and they're as easy to metabolize for microbes as they are for humans. So those are broken down quickly. In fact, most or all of the lactose has been consumed by the time the cheese is around 2 weeks old. So if in fact you are lactose intolerant, almost any cultured cheese you might buy should be fine for you. The exceptions here would be Chev, Burrata, sometimes mozzarella, which are traditionally eaten quite young. But that cultured part is the key, though. In most heat acid cheeses, little to no fermentation has taken place, and they're made at high enough temperatures that there are no live microbes remaining in the curd, other than what might get introduced from the surrounding environment as it sits around. So that's things like ricotta, paneer, cream cheese, things like that. If you're not sure if something is a heat acid or a cultured cheese, just look at the ingredients list. If it includes cultures, it'll probably be fine for you. So now let's talk about the "I'm lactose intolerant, but I can have goat milk" trope. It is true that sheep and goat milk have marginally less lactose than cow's milk, and in liquid milk it might be just enough to make a difference for you. But they definitely have lactose, otherwise we couldn't make cheese with them. Now, the real reason many people do better with sheep and goat products has nothing to do with sugars. It's because of the other major components of milk. The size and shape of the fat cells and protein structures in sheep and goat milk are different from cow milk, and they tend to be easier for humans to digest. Here's where we're going to go really deep into the curd verse, going down several levels of microscopic resolution within the milk. So hang on to your hat, I'm about to channel Miss Frizzle and her magic school bus here. The fat cells in sheep and goat milk are smaller than in cow milk. Some people are slow to metabolize animal fats in general, so heavy, fatty meals usually give them indigestion and heartburn. Smaller fat cells? A bit easier to break down. In addition, goat milk in particular has a relatively high amount of an enzyme called lipase or lipase. Just as lactase breaks down lactose, lipase breaks down fats or lipids during the cheese's aging process. But for many people, the real issue is not the fats or the sugars, it's the proteins in the milk. Now, there are a number of different types of proteins in milk, and when curd is separated from whey, some go with the curd and some go with the whey. Casein is the protein that provides most of the physical structure of the curd. For many people with protein sensitivities, the problems arise largely from the whey proteins. Now, whey proteins are also casein variants, but in cheese writing you'll usually see them referred to as whey proteins. So these whey proteins can even cause allergic reactions, as well as flare-ups in people with autoimmune diseases. And to be clear, these are not the same thing. I got schooled many years ago by an allergist about this. Not all food sensitivities are caused by allergies. If you have an autoimmune disorder and do an allergy panel, dairy may very well not show up in the panel, even if it does cause inflammation for you. So these proteins are made up of different types of amino acids. These amino acid chains can be of different lengths. Let's call them short, medium, and long. You can probably guess where I'm going with this. Yep, the longer chains are harder to digest. So just as with the fat, the species makes a real difference when it comes to protein structures. But so does the breed within a species. Sheep and goat milk mostly contain medium and short chain fatty acids. Cow milk is more likely to contain long chain versions. And the long chain version, which you'll see referred to sometimes as A1, is very common in the breed of cow that is the source of over 95% of the milk sold commercially in North America, the Holstein. Now, whether an animal gives A1 or A2, or only the shorter chain A2 milk, is a matter of genetics. Not all Holsteins give A1 milk, and there are other breeds that sometimes do give A1. So, for example, Jersey cattle, in aggregate, tend to be about 50-50 A1 versus A2 only. The only way to know is by genetically testing each animal. But the majority of Holsteins happen to be A1 cows, and in most cases, the milk that you and commercial cheesemakers buy is pooled from hundreds, if not thousands, of different animals, who of course aren't genetically tested. So you have to assume that there's a fair amount of the A1 protein in any mass market cow milk or cow cheese produced in North America. Some goat breeds do also sometimes give A1 milk, but it's less common. So given that the A1 protein seems to be problematic for some growing number of people, there have been some small-scale studies funded by various dairy industry groups about the benefits of A2 only milk. But I need to be completely clear about a couple of things. Some of them were conducted in rats, not humans, and the scale has been very small. There does appear to be some correlation with certain benefits, such as lower likelihood of inflammation and perhaps also less stress on diabetic people's systems. But the strength of that correlation and the exact relationship between the human digestive tract and A2 only milk has not been proven. If you want to dig into the details of that research for yourself, there's a link to a paper surveying the various studies in the show notes. That limited amount of data, of course, hasn't prevented random health food bloggers from claiming that A2 milk is a cure for everything from diabetes to autism, so you can ignore them. But that's the background behind the A2 brand of milk you may have started seeing in your local dairy case. If you drink liquid milk, but lactate isn't doing it for you and you don't like the taste of goat or nut milks, it's worth a shot. But the bigger thing to know from a cheese standpoint is that A1 proteins are the result of a mutation that happened somewhere in Europe, and they're most common in Northern European cow breeds, like Holsteins. They get rarer and rarer as you go south and east. So cheeses from Switzerland and places south of the Alps are much more likely to be A2 only. Purebred African and Asian cattle breeds are also A2 only, so are water buffalo. So if you're very attached to certain cow milk cheeses, but they aren't as friendly towards you, consider trying an imported version from Southern Europe and see if that works better for you. So now the obvious question to be asking is, how do I know what I'm reacting to? And one of the first things I asked my gastrodoc at my follow-up visit was, is there a test to know if my sensitivities are due to sugars or proteins? And he said, no. So that left me to figure it out on my own by process of elimination. I want to be clear that this is not something I attempted until that initial wave of awfulness had subsided. The first thing I tried was a couple of slices of sheep cheese I'd made, semi-hard, probably about 6 weeks old at that point. Just a couple of slices. And that was fine. A couple of days later, I tried a couple of slices of Cabral Vino, a semi-firm wine-soaked goat cheese of about the same age. Also fine. So then I tried a couple of slices of a firm cow cheese I'd made from Holstein cow milk about 3 months earlier. That was not fine. I had stabby guts within about 20 minutes. So, okay, no more A1 cow milk or cheese for me. Fortunately, the farmer I get my cheese-making milk from also keeps a herd of genetically tested A2 only cows. About 7 weeks later, I was able to confirm that indeed a gooey A2 reblochon was also okay for me. So this is noteworthy because most anti-inflammatory diet directions will tell you to avoid quote-unquote soft cheeses, which could mean anything from fresh cheeses to bloomy rinds to softer washed rind cheeses. That's because all of these cheese types retain a fair amount of whey, and they're mostly young enough that the whey proteins haven't broken down a lot yet. But the fact that I could eat this gooey cheese made from A2 only milk definitely gave me more options. So again, I want to stress this is what worked for me. My condition may be different from yours. It may be more or less severe than yours. The composition of my gut bacteria is definitely completely different from yours. Everyone's got their own unique snowflake of a gut microbiome. So my final 2 tests were chèvre and goat yogurt. Both are young, partially fermented, but still containing plenty of lactose and whey. Chèvre, again, was okay in small quantities, a couple of tablespoons on my salad. That was fine. Goat yogurt, I can have about 1/4 of a cup, definitely not more, and it's definitely a sometimes food. So again, the key here is not just the irritating component, whether it's sugars, proteins, or whatever, but also the amount. Some is okay for many people. More of the same might be too much. Just where that line is between some and too much will vary enormously from one person to the next. So once again, regardless of whether the source of your mild to moderate dairy issues is sugars, fats, or proteins, harder, longer-aged cheeses will have less problematic versions of all of those. So in your process of elimination exercise, start with those. You can also figure out if proteins are your problem by starting with sheep and goat cheeses. It could be a slice or two of Spanish Manchego, an aged Greek Mizithra, or a French Osso Hirati. Just read the label and make sure it only contains sheep or goat milk. Then wait a couple days and try a hardish cow milk cheese like an aged cheddar or jack. Again, just a couple of slices for now. So far so good? All right, try a triple cream brie, see what that does for you. And in another few days, try some yogurt. If you've got lactose issues, they'll start to show up there, even though you won't get the full blast you would with liquid milk. By the way, if your issue does seem to be proteins, talk to your doctor. There are a variety of conditions that dairy protein sensitivities can be a flag for, even if they haven't yet become noticeable in a more general way. But now you also know what some of your workarounds might be. I really hope this episode was helpful for you. If you have questions or comments about anything in this episode, be sure to drop me a line either on Twitter or on the contact page on my website. I would be more than happy to address them in a future episode. The good news is, it's spring! Baby sheep and goats are popping out everywhere, and that means lots of fresh young sheep and goat cheeses. So in the next episode, we'll be celebrating the arrival of spring by taking a look at a whole wide range of cheeses that are at their best right now. So join me next time as we once again enter the Curdverse.